In the 1960s, it was estimated that bluebird populations had declined by 90% in their historic range east of the Rocky Mountains over the previous 50 years. Since then, these populations have rebounded, in part due to efforts by restoration organizations, and bluebirds have recovered particularly well in the Badger State. Today, we're talking to Pat Reddy, who is president of the Bluebird Restoration Association of Wisconsin, about the decline and recovery of this beautiful species and what can be done to maintain this success.
I'm the president of the Bluebird Restoration Association of Wisconsin. I'm also the editor of their publication, Wisconsin Bluebird. And we have approximately 700 members in the state of Wisconsin and a few outside the state as well. We're an affiliate of the North American Bluebird Society. We're also the state that produces the most bluebirds recorded from our data from our membership and non-members in the state.
The question that we had was, we know that bluebirds were in a decline. At some point, I think as many as like 90% of the population declined. What was the cause for that particular species?
Yeah, a lot of it had to do with environmental changes that happened with the bluebirds over the last 100 years or so. One of the main things was the introduction of the English sparrow or the house sparrow. They were very competitive for the nesting spots that the bluebirds prefer to have. Bluebirds are very easy to attract with nest boxes. And of course, house sparrows like those nest boxes just as much as the bluebirds. Also, the European starling, another import from Europe, was competing with the bluebird in natural cavities. And so they were losing nesting sites to both those species. And on top of that, kind of just some of the changes in the agricultural world, they went from wooden fence posts that would rot out and bluebirds would nest in to metal fence posts. So they lost some nesting there. The other place that bluebirds really like to go to nest in rural areas was in orchards. And some of those old orchard apple trees and such would create some holes and pockets that the bluebirds could nest in. And a lot of those trees were replaced 50, 60 years ago by dwarf trees. And so those trees don't rot out as much. And so those somewhat agricultural practice change affected them a little bit. But the nesting spaces was definitely the concern going back in the, like 1950s and 60s. And that's when a guy out in Pennsylvania, I believe or out east anyway, was Lawrence Elaney. And he's the one who decided that, we need to start putting out nest boxes for bluebirds and kind of nationwide effort to put out trail systems or even a single box or two. And so by putting out nest boxes and having some organized management of those boxes, that was what really helped bring back the bluebird. And in Wisconsin, it started back, I think it was in the 80s, when the DNR actually launched the Bluebird Restoration Association of Wisconsin, and they funded it for 3 years. Then after that, it became a nonprofit corporation and took over with its own board of directors and everything. So by trying to maintain trails and membership and data reports each year, we've been able to bring back the bluebird to Wisconsin and get its numbers back up. Respectable, but still not where they should have been, where they should be from like 150 years ago. We're still hurting in that respect, but we do have a lot more bluebirds than we had 50 years ago.
So at what point did people realize that species was in trouble? Because we always hear stories about the passenger pigeon, how they went from millions of birds to none. How did people realize that we need to do something about these bluebirds or else they might disappear?
Okay, well, in Wisconsin and probably other states as well, there's annual surveys called breeding bird surveys. And so those are what really started to highlight the fact that bluebird numbers were hurting in a lot east of the Rocky Mountains. And in Wisconsin, back in the mid to late 60s, I think they estimated there was only about 600 pairs of bluebirds in Wisconsin.
Wow.
And it was very hard to actually find a bluebird, out in the wild back then.
That's crazy to
Another
think
thing,
about.
yeah. I mean, some people think 600 sounds like a lot, but if you consider the entire state, that's really a low number. One way to look at it is, in today's standards, for every pair of bluebirds that's trying to nest in a nest box, there's probably 3 or 4 pair of tree swallows, 5 pair of house sparrows or more. Then there's also chickadees and house wrens, and they're 3 times as plentiful as bluebirds. And that's today's data. So going back to the 60s, that proportion was probably way off, and a lot worse than it is today. So bluebirds still have a lot of competition, but like I said, with management and proper placement of the nest boxes, we've been able to find ways to give the bluebirds a slight advantage there.
It's interesting to me that there's these things that happen that have impacts people don't expect, like those fence posts being metal. Like, I'm sure whoever decided, hey, we should make these metal, didn't have any idea that would affect bluebird nesting or anything like that.
Yeah, right. I don't really know what part that factor into it, but it did reduce their nesting sites for sure. And of course, metal poles, almost last forever unless they rust out. But the other thing is about, the orchards. Nobody really thought that making dwarf apple trees and having more apples produced in less space would affect something like that. But, bluebirds are very anchored in the rural part of Wisconsin. And that's pretty much what got BRAW launched as well as it did. Is a lot of the people that grew up on farms, on dairy farms in Wisconsin, realized that the bluebirds weren't there. They didn't need the breeding bird surveys to tell them that. They could see that the bluebird was in decline because, they were still around farms and in rural areas, and they just noticed that they didn't see as many bluebirds as they did when they were kids. They weren't pinpointing any particular cause of that, but it was definitely out there.
So, with the organization starting, how did that look when it first started with the DNR funding and everything? Like, did you guys host workshops for people to make bluebird boxes, or was it handing out instructions? How exactly did that all play out?
Well, the first thing they did was they made membership free for the first 3 years. So you didn't have to pay anything. It still isn't that much. It's only like $25 a year to be a member. But what they did is they tried to organize in each county a county coordinator. And then in the springtime, they organized what they called nest box seminars. And so they would pick a place. Usually it was like a store in a small town or someplace like that, where they could gather a few people together. And then a couple of the guys that had built bluebird houses would just explain, which box that they would use and preferred and all that kind of stuff. And tell people basically they could build their own or they could buy a box that's made, and just how to go about setting it up. And whether they wanted to do one box or if they wanted to do 25 didn't matter. They just kind of explained to them, sort of a protocol. And what we found out is that by spacing a single box every 100 yards or so, that gives bluebird pairs enough space so that they can nest, in each box and have enough habitat around them where they don't compete.
I was going
Some
to
states,
ask,
go ahead.
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say some states say put 2 boxes up per site, one for bluebirds and one for the other cavity nesters. But in the state of Wisconsin, we found that it didn't really help bluebirds that much, and that it helped house sparrows and tree swallows a lot more than it did bluebirds. So we recommend 1 box per 100 yards.
Yeah, it seems to me like whenever I see bluebirds nesting somewhere, you see a complete absence of house sparrows. It seems like whenever the house sparrows are present, they just take over all of the nest boxes in the area. I don't usually see them kind of side by side with bluebirds.
Yeah, right. And a lot of people that put up a single box in their backyard, say they live out in a country subdivision or something, either they have the hopes of getting a bluebird or perhaps they get a bluebird as soon as they put the nest box up in spring. But inevitably, those people have to deal with house sparrows, right? Because house sparrows just like to be around people and bird feeders, and so they're naturally attracted to the same places where bluebirds are in backyards. So that's kind of an unfortunate thing, but I usually warn people that, that might be an issue.
Yeah,
Is
and how
there
can you prevent the house sparrows from getting into the bluebird box? Is there anything you can do with the size of the hole or any sort of deterrent?
No, you can't for bluebirds because house sparrows and bluebirds basically can use that 1.5 inch hole to get in and out. There are a couple of boxes that are designed that are supposedly anti-house sparrow. There's one called a Troyer slot box. There's a PVC Gilbertson box that's popular in Minnesota in some areas. I've tried them all, and I have to say that eventually house sparrows figure out a way to use a nest box, or to, at least the males will claim the box even if he doesn't get a hen to come to it, and that creates the problems for bluebirds right there. Now, a good strong bluebird male will drive off house sparrows, and if we could have some more of those, that'd be great. But unfortunately, there's some mean house sparrows out there that are very adamant about keeping a box.
so you're
So I
you're
try to
telling me
tell
they need
people
to
that,
man up then?
yeah, that would be a good idea, right? But I try to put my boxes where house sparrows aren't an issue so much. Um, and there is no way to prevent them from entering the hole other than making the hole too small. And so it works well if you're trying to attract wrens or chickadees. You can just put a hole that's 1 1/8 or smaller. House sparrows can't get in, but that doesn't work for bluebird because they need the same size hole that house sparrows can get in. So it's best to put it out in bluebird habitat and try and get it away from house sparrows. If you have a persistent problem with house sparrows, a recommended method is to trap them and get rid of them that way. Or like I said, you can't just keep pulling the nest out, because after 5 or 6 weeks, they may give up, and you might get rid of that house sparrow pair that's trying to use that box by nesting. But as soon as they leave, you might get another house sparrow pair, and then you got another 6 weeks, and then you lose your actually of trying to attract bluebirds. So I like to try and find places that the bluebirds will use the box, but house sparrows won't. I can possibly do that. And I've got some pretty good trails in the Dane County area that works for me pretty well, actually.
That's great. So there was a really great article about the bluebird recovery in the journal Sentinel, and that's actually how we got hooked up with you and your work. And there was a stat in there that
Mm-hmm.
said in 2012 that the organization helped account for over 32,000 bluebird fledglings. That's an incredible number, especially seeing, how few that the population got down to. So how does it feel to have
Yeah.
that it's been that successful?
Well, it was great. It was one of those years where it caught a lot of us by surprise, and myself. I was actually going to monitor my trails at Lake Eganza State Park, and I was just planning to just make sure that they were cleaned out in the end of March. And generally, I see bluebird pairs around that time of year, but in my area here, I don't usually find nesting until mid-April or so. And that last week of March, 3 boxes had bluebird nests with 3 eggs already. And I thought, wow, I mean, we didn't have an unusually warm March that would trigger them to start early. I really couldn't figure out what's going on. And then I started corresponding with some other bluebird people and members of the BRAW board. And I found out that they too were starting to find bluebirds nesting early that year. And by the time the season got over, we all realized that a lot of us had triple broods in boxes, which means that instead of having the typical 2 broods of nesting per season, they were actually pulling off a 3rd one because they started so early. And then we also had some phenomenally warm spring weather. We didn't have those late winter snowstorms in April and things or the late spring snowstorms in April. So there were a lot of factors that favored the bluebird that year. And that was our highest number that we ever did produce. And since about 2002, when the state of Wisconsin decided to go with single box spacing instead of pairing boxes, we had an uphill climb that just kept increasing the bluebirds for 10 straight years. And then we got to that peak, and we really thought, oh, great, this is where we want to be. But then we had some really bad spring weather for the last 5 or 6 years. And so now kind of a bar chart that goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And this past year, I believe we are somewhere around 16,000. So that's from our reported members and non-members that send us in data from last year. So that doesn't sound great. It's half of what it was in 2012, but it's just the seasonal factors that can influence bluebird production. And so we never really know. We can do what we can for managing and monitoring. We can't control everything to help the bluebirds in every way. So we just keep diligently trying with the monitoring and trails and nest boxes out there.
So what's kind of the ideal number to get bluebirds as a species kind of out of the woods of being one of those species that might decline more in Wisconsin? So at what point do you kind of say, we've done enough to get this species to stabilize now with the nest boxes and stuff, where we can kind of not worry about them as much?
Yeah, you know what? I didn't realize this until about 3 or 4 years ago, that when it comes to bluebirds, I don't think they'll ever do well on their own as long as we still have English house sparrows and European starlings around. And they're not going to be leaving. So unfortunately, I think the bluebird success is going to really depend on people putting out nest boxes and really monitoring them. Because if we would just stop right now and just let the trails go, the boxes would be out there. They would have nesting sites. But eventually those boxes, without anybody caring for them, would either get house sparrows or mice or wrens if they get overgrown and stuff like that. So unfortunately, it's kind of in our hands now. We're the ones that have to help them along.
So what can people do if they want to get involved and help and put up nest boxes? Like, what's the best course of action for them?
Well, the best thing is to find the location first, the right habitat. Bluebirds like to have short grasses that they can find food in because they eat a lot of insects, and they feed their young a lot of insects that they find on the ground. So even though you can put a nest box up in a tall grass prairie, it won't do much to attract bluebirds unless there's mowed grass areas nearby. And so a lot of times, like I have boxes in state parks and county parks and also golf courses. But I find that the state parks and county parks, even though they have restored prairie areas, they usually have picnic areas, ball game areas, or paths for skiing in the winter or something where there's grass. And I always seem to be able to find niches like that that attract bluebirds. Now, without a lot of houses and people there feeding bird feeders out in their yards and stuff, it doesn't attract as many sparrows as I would if I were in a subdivision or something like that. So I kind of select the places in these parks where I find it best for bluebirds, and that habitat is key. Once you got that selected, then you put a pole in the ground, put out a nest box, and go another 100 yards if you got the space. If you don't have 100 yards, just put out 1 or 2 and see what happens. In one of my city parks here, I have 5 boxes in Madison, Elver Park. And I usually get 2 pair of bluebirds out of those 5 boxes. And much of a trail, I check it on my bike. But, if I didn't have those boxes there at all, we wouldn't have bluebirds nesting in the city like this. So just simple. I mean, it's 5 minutes away from my house. Just ride down there and check the boxes. And one of the boxes right now has 3 bluebird chicks in it. So it doesn't, it's not a lot of science or a lot of work, really. I just had to get permission from the city, or in the case of a county park, I just contact the county, or state parks, I contact the ranger. And as long as I am going to maintain the boxes, or anybody's going to maintain the boxes, and I often give them reports on what I find at the end of the year, or I remove the boxes if I decide it's not a good place. They don't mind having boxes in their areas, but they want somebody that's going to be responsible for them. So once you put the boxes up, then it's just a matter of waiting for the bluebirds to show up and check the boxes once a week.
So if people want to get a bluebird box, are there blueprints online on how to make them, or can you buy these pre-bought? How do people go about getting and having the actual physical box to put up?
Okay, there's a lot of varieties of bluebird boxes out there, all different shapes and sizes. The main thing is you want a box that's the right size and shape for a bluebird. I happen to have one here that I can show you. It's called the North American Bluebird Society box. And a lot of times the stores sell this type of a nest box and opens up from the side so you can check the box and clean it out. It's got a pin that goes in the back, or a nail like that goes in the back to keep this shut when the bluebirds are nesting. It's made out of 3/4 inch cedar. It can be vented if you need to. I think venting in Wisconsin or hot summers, especially like the hot summer we're having this year, vent is important. This one just happens to drop down and creates a 1/2 inch space there. A lot of times they drill holes up here to allow the venting. But that's all it really takes is a nice box. Some of the plastic boxes might be a little bit cold for our Wisconsin springs. You know, they're not as highly recommended as a 3/4 inch wooden box. I make a lot of mine out of pine, but I use this style. I use this nab style. It's got the right size bottom and everything they need for the space to comfortably nest. You know, years ago when raccoons were a really big issue, they could reach in and grab the eggs or the chicks out. They decided to build a really big, tall. Well, bluebirds don't like going way down into the box like tree swallows do, so they just built their nest taller. And then the eggs and the chicks were right in the entrance, so they didn't want the raccoons. So that brings up predators, you know, too. We got to deal with predators, raccoons, and things like, and cats. So there's ways of treating the pole that you put the box on, either with greasing it or putting PVC over it, or there's a cage you can put on the front of the box that's actually called a coon guard, and you can keep the predators out that way.
So if people want to get involved with your organization, how can they be part of that, and what are the benefits?
Okay, well, we do have a website that's BRAW.org, BRAW.org, and there is a way to join membership there. We do have a booklet called an information packet, and that comes as when you're a member, you get a welcome letter with that information packet. It's an 8-page booklet, basically, newsletters type thing. And it has everything you pretty much need to know about setting up a bluebird box, setting up a trail if you want, some of the things to expect, problems that you might incur. And it also has a nest guide in the middle of it that shows you what a bluebird nest looks like all the way down to when they fledge. And then also has the other native cavity nesters like tree swallows, chickadees, and house wrens. And then we have a quarterly newsletter, the Wisconsin Bluebird, that comes out, and that gives you information 4 times a year. And that's also where we report our data, so our members know what's going on as far as the bluebird numbers go. And anybody that reports to us, we do, in one of the issues, print their names and total boxes and total fledglings that they had, if they want us to. And we put that in there so that so people can kind of see sometimes. Then we also put the county, so people can kind of see, like, county-wise around the state, how things are going. So we can always use new members.
Wonderful. I think a lot of people would probably be interested in that. Bluebirds are just, there's something very captivating about them that's really easy to, like, get excited about.
Yeah, you know, it's like that they have the prettiest song, like a cardinal or anything like that, but there is something about a bluebird. I mean, I grew up in the city, and I was 28 years old before I actually saw my first bluebird out in the wild, and that was in the southern Kettle Moraine, south of Economowoc. But something about that bird and hearing it sing, I just thought, boy, that's a cool bird. And then I started checking out on what you can do to attract them. And it probably wasn't until another 15 or 20 years before I actually got involved in an organization like BRAW and started doing a trail, and got kind of hooked into it. And I tell you, it's something you look forward to every season, you know, getting started and seeing the bluebirds and watching the nest development, eggs laid, and the fledglings and everything. So yeah, it's been a great hobby.
I feel like they are more numerous now too, or at least I see them more often. It seems like anywhere where there's kind of rural, you know, farm fields and grass areas, I see them, it seems, nowadays. So the work you guys are doing is definitely starting to pay off, I think.
Yeah, it's been paying off. I tell you, you've probably heard this from other organizations, maybe, but uh, to get younger people involved in an organization like ours is an uphill battle because, yeah, younger people don't see the problem with bluebirds like I did when I was a kid. I never saw one. They're going out and seeing bluebirds or hearing bluebirds or whatever, and I don't think they really see um, bluebird restoration as much of an effort as older people like I do. In my mid 60s, and I didn't grow up on a farm or anything, but I do know that bluebirds are going to need our help for a long time. So we're trying to work to get younger people involved, and I think a lot of other organizations are doing the same thing. But yeah, we need a lot of people to sort of pick up the mantle and keep this thing going.
So if you're starting out, if, say someone's new to putting a bluebird box up and the brood isn't successful or they don't get bluebirds, you'd say don't get discouraged, right? Like keep going and
Oh yeah,
keep
yeah,
trying.
right. It's as long as you have nesting season, which starts at the end of March, early April, and goes until about the end of July, early August. There's a chance you can get bluebirds in that nest box. So until we get to August, and if I got boxes that don't have nest in, then I pretty much know I'm not going to probably have them anymore. And I just check the boxes that have got chicks that are going to fledge pretty soon. At some parts of the state, La Crosse area, I think they have bluebirds that nest well into August and they fledge in September. So, I tell people if you got a nest box and want to put it up, it's not going to do any good sitting in your basement or your garage. As long as you can pound a pole in the ground, November, October, get that box in the ground because it's easier to pound a pole in the ground then than it is to wait until February or March when the ground's frozen and then go, oh, I want to put up a bluebird box. It's much easier to do it during the warmer months. So anytime you put one up, you're probably helping a bluebird or native cavities nester.
Awesome. Well, we will put links to the organization and other things people can use to learn more about bluebirds and stuff like that in the description when we post the video. And thanks so much for your efforts and for taking the time to talk with us.
Okay, appreciate you guys and what you're doing too, spreading the word.
Oh,
Thanks for having me
thanks.
on.
Yeah, of course. Well, you have a great rest of your day and we'll talk to you soon.
We'll see you in the bird world.
All right. Thanks, Pat.